Welcome everyone. As everyone is logging in, just welcome from everyone here. I just wanted to give another couple of minutes for people to log on. Thank you. Welcome everyone. I'm Giulia Corinaldi. I'm the Director of Inclusive Economy for the Thomson Reuters Foundation. As more people are logging in every second, I'm just going to take this time to run through quickly the agenda and some of the logistics. First of all, we're truly excited to be launching the research workplace laws to combat domestic violence. And the agenda today will have a few keynotes, a welcoming remarks from Antonio Zappulla from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and then welcome keynotes from Gabriela Ramos. We will have a first panel moderated by Belinda Goldsmith, Editor-in-Chief for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, that will focus on domestic violence at the workplace and existing policy responses. We'll have then a second panel on the role of companies in tackling domestic violence that will be moderated by Mina Schieterman. And then we'll move on to closing remarks from Monica Kisser, Head of Social Policy Division at OECD. The logistic for today are, please keep muted at all time and video off at all time. Only the speakers will be unmuted when they speak. If you have any question for the panelists, please insert them in the Q&A. I will keep track of it and select some of the questions. We only have time for 1 or 2 questions per panel, so I will select it, and then the moderator will ask it directly to the speakers. So we won't go to you. So please make sure you state your name, surname, and title when you post the question, and for whom the question is for. And again, please post it in the Q&A button at the bottom of the bar, as you can see it below. And then the event will be recorded and it will be live tweet on social media. So remember that when you're commenting or sending questions through. And then another thing, you will find the research at trust.org, and the link will be shared with you at the end of the event and through the email that we will be sending at the end of the event. And with no further ado, I'm delighted to pass the virtual mic to Antonio Zappulla, the CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Giulia. Hello and welcome, everyone. It's really great to have such a great turnout for this event. I'm Antonio Zappulla. I'm CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where our work is dedicated to defending media freedom, fostering more inclusive economies, and advancing human rights. And the way we work is through a unique combination of legal and journalism skills. We use journalism training, convening initiatives such as this one, and legal research to drive systemic change. Research like the one that we are presenting today, a very relevant and comprehensive work to help protect victims of domestic violence through the workplace. The report, Workplace Laws to Combat Domestic Violence, is a joint initiative led by her and Kering Foundation, and created with support from our global pro bono legal network, TrustLaw, and of course, Dentons. As you will hear from our panel of experts today, this research is badly needed. Recent figures from the World Health Organization show that 1 in 3 women around the world is affected by domestic violence. And this is very much a hidden crime. It's one that may occur behind closed doors, but it's one which impacts people beyond their front doors. And that is because people who experience domestic violence often have to go back to work, have to put a brave smile on their faces and make up all sorts of excuses pretending that everything is just fine. And that, of course, affects attendance, productivity, relationships with colleagues, career progression, and inevitably salary and career progression. So how can we ensure that colleagues look after each other? How can we make sure that the workplace becomes a safe space? The timing for this research could not be more relevant. The lockdown of cities and entire countries due to COVID-19 has translated into a steep rise in reports of domestic violence. There are now countless reports out there that make this correlation undeniable. And what's particularly interesting is that these episodes are occurring at home, at a time where home is the office for so many people. We believe the role of business in helping to address and mitigate domestic violence is critical. And this research has the power to unlock significant potential. Some of you might remember that last year we hosted a working group in Paris with Kering Foundation, where we brought together women's rights organizations to discuss the most challenging issues that they were facing. Now, this report is one of the number of key initiatives resulting from that forum. And as a result of the meeting together with Dentons, we put together an incredible team of pro bono lawyers around the globe, including, by the way, lawyers also from Thomson Reuters Australia to conduct this research. We are very proud to have facilitated this work. Domestic violence is a violation of human rights, and addressing this issue is key to building more equitable, participatory, and sustainable economies. So I hope you'll find the report and today's discussion useful, and that this virtual meeting will ignite a movement to change the way we look at domestic violence and the role of employers and governments in addressing this issue in the workplace. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's keynote speaker. She's a world expert and an advocate on these issues. She's simply great. Gabriela Ramos, she's the Assistant Director General for Social and Human Science at UNESCO. Gabriela, great to see you again, although virtually this time, and over to you. Gabriela, I think you're muted.
Yeah, but it said that I was going to be unmuted by you, but okay. No, thank you so much, Antonio. Thank you so much to Julia and to, of course, the Kering Foundation and Thomson Reuters. And this is my first presentation as Assistant Director General from UNESCO. We have worked so much with the OECD that I'm really glad to participate in this debate. I know at the OECD we have been conducting a lot of work to put the violence against women very high in the agenda. And actually, one of the latest big events that we organized before the pandemic was on the substance of violence against women. I think this is the hidden pandemic, as you said, Antonio, damaging and ravaging our social ties, destroying lives, and putting a lot of pressure in our societies. And I think that really kudos to Thomson Reuters and also to the Kering Foundation led here for this report that you are preparing, very focused, very concise on something that I feel provide interesting insight on how to deal with the issues from the perspective of the private sector. It's impossible. Where do we start? Do we start by saying that 1 in 3 women have experienced violence in their lives around the world? Or do we start by recognizing that during the pandemic, at the confinement, there was a 50% increase in violence against women in Colombia, 30% in France? So it's not even a question what's the level of development or the institutional progress in the countries, but the reality is that this is something that is affecting all of the countries worldwide and is really putting a lot of pressure in our families, and a lot of pressure on the women that are actually suffering these issues. The pandemic brought a lot of stress just because it's causing all these human casualties and lots of pain. But the additional issue of the confinement measures and the fact that we are having this result in terms of women experiencing violence is really unacceptable. But it was even unacceptable before. In our conference at the OECD, we had the terrible figure that 38% of the causes of death for women are at the hands of their internet partners, 38%. So it's even higher than any other illness that you can imagine. And I suppose that is even higher than COVID. So the discussion today is really very important. As I said, no country is immune to this pandemic. Everywhere, we hear this being reported everywhere. In my own country, there was a 65% increase on feminicides since the last April and March. And then, of course, is creating a lot of consequences then are very difficult to manage from the perspective of the economic development. The impact of domestic violence cannot be contained at home. This is a fact. When your life is in constant danger, how can you even stay at home? But then the reality is that when you translate it to the workplaces, and women that need to go to continue their work activities, their jobs, conditions that are completely stressful, it's really hitting the ground in terms of how do we help. And so the discussion that you are launching today is very timely in that perspective, because it's really being very focused on how can business support this endeavor to protect victims and to help the victims that are suffering violence to advance and to move forward. Business well placed because employers are often uniquely placed to support survivors, to the provision of legal advice, to housing support, to childcare support. How many women really go to work to escape from the terrible situation they confront at home? So, but as you said, Antonio, it's not only the question of how businesses can organize their support to the victims, but the truth is that we should also recognize that violence against women has a very important economic cost. And of course, the first issue is a moral ground. The first issue is human right. But the reality is that it's also having an impact on businesses. And this is something that your report presents very nicely. Not only in terms of the mental health, the extreme stress that people suffer because of this, but also it turns down workplace productivity. It contributes to absenteeism and loss of managerial time to investigate complaints and legal expenses. And of course, for victims, how could you continue working, and how can you advance your career or your wages if you cannot even concentrate being subject of this terrible situation? A study by the European Institute for Gender Equality found that domestic violence is associated with 122 billion euro cost per year, counted as a loss of economic production due to absences. And let me tell you, 122 billion is what we dedicate in ODA for the support of all the developing countries. So you can imagine the size of the impact. Initial OECD research also suggests that being assaulted may be equivalent in life satisfaction terms to losing between 50,000 and 90,000 US dollars of annual income. So it might sound crude, and sometimes these estimates are crude. Very often, putting a number on an issue is an effective way to drawing attention to it. Not only this is a burden for victims, it's a burden for our societies as well. So as I said, we welcome a report prepared by the Kering Foundation, led by her, and Thomson Reuters Foundation, looking at the impact of domestic violence spilling over to the workplace. I'm sure that you're gonna go into the insights of the report, but we found really that there are great examples of employer-led interventions and support for victims in the form of providing flexible working arrangements or paid and unpaid leave. We also found that you have interesting examples of countries that provide legal mechanisms to protect workers who are facing these challenges. Issues like you cannot be fired because you have behavioral consequences resulting from domestic violence. So there are many examples, but I still think there are also many other ways in which companies can support the issues. There's a lot of space for public-private cooperation. Of course, the public sector needs to lead and set the tone in terms of the workplace measures for women that are facing violence, regulations, the institutions, how to monitor the implementation, how to give guidance, how to support those employees that are really supporting women that are facing in this condition, but also governments to monitor progress. So we need a strong laws, we need a stronger regulation and institutional support, but we also need, as we discover in our work in the OECD, to provide integrated service delivery and close the loopholes in judicial systems. But then, of course, we need to keep a broader and flexible mind for these issues. We need to see if the survivor need legal advice, or if they need housing support, if their children are also suffering and they might need also help, because we know that children are usually witnesses of the terrible scenes of violence at their home. In the European Union level, almost 3 in 4 women experience domestic violence are caregivers of children who witness the abuse. So companies could raise awareness, provide pro bono legal advice, provide subsidies or days off to help with childcare or more. There are many ways and they can support. But then finally, and going deeper, estimating the cost is the most effective way to get rid of this global pandemic. I think it really needs to improve our understanding of these issues. We need to, according to our CE index of cultural and institutional elements that gets into these very unequal and unacceptable outcomes, 1 in 3 women think that domestic violence is justified. And men also think it's justified if they burn a meal. So this is like, how could you accept that? But our societies accept that. And therefore, we need to change these gender-based expectations. We need to change the harmful masculinities and negative patriarchal structures that reinforce these violations of our most basic human rights. I will continue working with you from UNESCO. I know Monica now from the OECD will be also continue to partnering with you, but I think this is a very important issue, and I really like the way you have framed the discussion, and thank you for inviting me to provide with these initial remarks.
Gabriela, thank you so much. That was inspiring and set the right tone for this wonderful discussion. And we wish you luck for your first day of UNESCO. So thank you. And I think I'm now passing the mic to Belinda Goldsmith, Editor-in-Chief at the Foundation, to moderate our first panel. So to you, Belinda.
Thanks very much, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Belinda Goldsmith. I'm the Editor-in-Chief at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where I run a team, an award-winning team of about 55 journalists covering human rights and inclusive economies. And a major focus for us, of course, is women's rights and women's inclusion. So I'm delighted to be moderating the panel today. The plan is, first of all, to introduce our panelists. I think most of you have already seen everyone's bios, so I'm delighted to say that we have Chiara Condi, who is the founder of Led by Her with us. We have Catherine Coulter from Dentons, the legal team that worked on this really important report. We have Marceline Naudi, President of Grevio, the body overseeing the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. And we have Manuela Tomi, Director of the ILO's Work Quality Department. We've heard, of course, from Antonio and from Gabriela on the numbers and the impact that domestic violence has on women around the world. So what can companies do? What should lawmakers be doing to support employees who are affected by domestic violence? Should countries be bringing in national laws, or is the role of companies to help their staff? Chiara, if I can turn to you first of all, could you tell us why it was so important to do this report now and some of the major findings from this report?
Yes, so hi, thank you, Linda. So first of all, it was really, really important to do this work because for the last 7 years, Led by Her has been working with victims, survivors of domestic violence, and we've been particularly helping them rebuild their professional lives. And that's really, really important because we often think of domestic violence as an issue that takes place inside the home, but it has very clear workplace consequences, and it has very big consequences on the professional lives of the women who are affected. And greater risk of economic precarity can leave them in greater cycles of violence, of which they cannot come out of. And so not only do they suffer from violence, but then they remain trapped in the situation, and they may lose their job, it may create breaks in their career. And all this we've seen is extremely difficult to help rebuild once it's broken. So that's why we said we want to be proactive, and we want to address this issue and say, what can we do so that workplaces protect women so that this does not happen and they do not suffer other consequences from violence. And some of the things that we saw in the report was that things that companies can effectively do is to give victims paid or unpaid leave, flexible work arrangements, temporary protection against dismissal, and then include domestic violence in workplace risk assessments, and create a referral system and a process, a policy in place to deal with these things, and also raise awareness about the issue in the company, and creating a climate of confidence and trust where people can also feel that they can talk about this in the company, and that the company will deal with this in an efficient way are very important. And of course, in an ideal world, we would like this to be legislation that's taken at the national level, because we would like all women who have suffered from violence to be protected. And if all women were protected, none of them would lose their job and be in greater economic precarity and suffer the consequences. But of course, companies can also take the initiative and do it themselves and put it in their policies if the country is not doing it, to make sure that all women have a chance to be safe and economically secure, which is the least thing we can give them if they've suffered from violence.
Right, thanks, Carol. If I come to Catherine, the report looked at six different jurisdictions: Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Italy, France, and Ontario in Canada. Could you explain briefly what Canada has put in place to protect women in the workplace and why this was done?
Absolutely. Thank you, Belinda. First of all, I'd like to thank our law students, Liz McClellan and Samantha Spector, for their assistance with this project for Canada, as well as my colleagues around the globe who assisted Thomson Reuters and the others with preparing the report and doing all the underlying legal work. In terms of Canada, I'm from the province of Ontario. Canada has 10 provinces, 3 territories. And we looked specifically at the province of Ontario, but I will speak in a moment to the other provinces as well. Ontario, because of a situation that occurred over a decade ago where a woman was killed in the workplace by her partner who worked in the same workplace, decided to undertake some fairly stringent litigation. And I'm proud to say that Ontario appears to lead the world when it comes to legislative protections. Generally speaking, there are 2 types of protections in Ontario. One is a statutory leave of absence. It is a partially paid leave of absence followed by an unpaid leave of absence. And it's a fairly lengthy period of time for women who have domestic violence issues to deal with those issues before they need to return to work, knowing that their job will be safe and secure at the end of the day for them. The other concept is protection under our occupational health and safety legislation. And in Ontario in particular, that requires that employers have a workplace violence plan, and that plan specifically includes discussion about what will happen in the event of a domestic violence situation in particular. It requires employers who become aware of instances of domestic violence that affect their employees to speak with the employees and try to come up with a plan that will protect that employee in the workplace. Moving on to the other provinces and territories, I'm pleased to say that as Ontario implemented this, other provinces and territories began to come on board. It varies across the country, but generally speaking in Canada, most provinces have some sort of legislative leave protection, and many of the provinces have protection under occupational health and safety legislation, although it does not necessarily always extend to specifically carving out domestic violence. But by and large, there are tremendous protections across Canada. It of course comes down to whether or not companies are compliant with the legislation at the end of the day, but the legislation is there for employees to go to the ministries of labor within the various provinces across the country to get the relief sought if the employers are not compliant.
And do you think more needs to be done, Catherine, to make sure that companies are compliant? What more can be done?
you know, it really very much depends on a company by company basis. Dentons Canada is the leading international law firm globally, and we have clientele that by and large is quite large and quite sophisticated. And so I would say that for those types of clients, for the larger companies, the mid-level companies across the country, most of them are aware of their obligations and I think comply with their obligations. Where things may potentially fall through the cracks is with smaller companies that don't have an understanding of their obligations.
Okay, thank you. Marceline, if I could come to you, the Istanbul Convention was set up to prevent and combat violence against women and domestic violence and opened for signature in 2011. Could you give us an update on how many countries have now signed the convention and how many have ratified it so that they are now legally bound by its provisions?
Yes, Belinda, and thanks for pulling me in here. There's 46 states in all that have signed, that is, they have signed their intent to ratify, and of these 46, 34 have actually ratified, which means they are now legally bound to implement the convention, leaving 12 who signed but have not yet ratified, including the UK, since the study also includes the UK. Also important to note that non-Council of Europe members can also request to accede to the convention. The EU has signed but not yet ratified. Hopefully they will do so. And other countries, such as Tunisia even, have requested to join. So the Grevio, of which I'm president, actually monitors the country's implementations. It suggests recommendations to bring them closer to full implementation of the convention. We've already completed and published 13 monitoring reports, including France and Italy, and another 8 are in process. So the convention covers violence against women and domestic violence wherever it occurs, whether it's in the home or in the streets or in places of work. And this is, of course, very important. It also includes a specific article on sexual harassment, and it includes another article, Article 17, which is about involving the private sector in the fight against violence against women and domestic violence. So that would include companies that Catherine was talking about earlier, whether large or small.
And we've obviously seen numbers of domestic violence and violence against women spiking during coronavirus lockdowns. Do you think this could be something that could spur other governments to sign and ratify the convention?
I certainly hope so. It's sad that we have had the spike, but of course it was inevitable. If people are locked down in a home with their abuser, then it is inevitable that domestic violence is going to spike. There's been a lot of media attention which has been given as a result of the COVID to domestic violence and violence against women and femicides, as we heard Gabriela say earlier, so during the pandemic. There have also been many, believe me, many webinars, high-level meetings, declarations, statements issued, etc. So COVID has succeeded in shining this bright light on the problems that we have been pushing to get onto the agenda. And this is good. However, we need more than a bright light. We need actions to be taken, both in those countries that are still grappling with the pandemic, and in those that are beginning to emerge and possibly are now facing a recession. And we have always been clear that the Istanbul Convention applies in sickness and in health. For women to leave an abusive relationship, they need to be assured that they will find the help and support that they need. And this is also where employers can enter the equation. It also means, of course, having knowledgeable and empathic people, whether employers, supervisors, human resources personnel in larger companies, people that understand the gendered nature of domestic violence and violence against women.
Right, thank you very much. Manuel, if I can come to you, the ILO last June adopted a convention about violence and the workplace. Why did governments need to implement this legislation as well? And what are the best practices the ILO convention specifies in terms of domestic violence?
Thank you, Belinda, and good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, last June, the constituents of the ILO, namely governments, workers, and employers organizations, adopted Convention 190 on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work, Convention 190, as well as Recommendation 206, which is non-binding but provides practical guidance on how to implement the convention. These two instruments have been defined as historic and groundbreaking. Why? Because they define for the first time what violence and harassment at work is and provide a roadmap for preventing and addressing it. The convention and recommendation cover all forms of violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment that comprises sexual harassment. It applies to all sectors of the economy, private and public sectors alike, enterprises of all sizes, and it applies also to homes where these are a workplace, as in the case of a domestic worker or people in telework. It recognizes that domestic violence becomes an issue for the world of work when it undermines the ability of the victim of domestic violence to go to work, to perform work, or it becomes a threat to co-workers or third parties such as patients, clients, and students, for instance. And the obligation that it imposes on states is to recognize the link between domestic violence and the world of work and to take measures to mitigate the impact of domestic violence on the workplace. And the type of measures that are being put forward in the recommendation 206, which are drawn from good experiences and practices across the world, include many of those that have been already mentioned, such as introduction of paid or unpaid leave, flexible work arrangements, temporary protection against dismissal, and inclusion of domestic violence in workplace risk assessments and mitigation plans, because indeed domestic violence, when it is a world of work issue, can be dealt with through different angles, as it has already been stated, through OSH legislation, as well as non-discrimination, equality discrimination, or through labor code.
It would seem obvious that government should, implement this legislation. So what are the challenges? Why is it not happening?
Well, it's still early times now with regard to the convention, but I'm very glad to indeed say that we received in the midst of the pandemic, actually 10 days ago, the first two ratifications of the convention, which means that now the convention will enter into force in 1 year from now. One of the many challenges relates to the fact that the interest and capacity of enterprises to address domestic violence is very diverse, as also Catherine mentioned earlier on. Large companies and multinationals are increasingly taking action to protect their employees. They see it as part of their duty of care, their duty of contributing to the creation of a work environment which is safe and healthy. Moreover, reputational risks in case of inaction can be very high for large enterprises. But for small enterprises that represent the large majority of the business universe, mitigating the impact of domestic violence in the workplace may be more challenging. And indeed, these were some of the hottest issues that we debated last June and the June before during the conference and the ILO. There was a concern that the obligations that may be imposed on small enterprises in order to comply with addressing the effects of domestic violence in the workplace would result into cumbersome and unreasonable requirements compared to the very modest resources that they have at disposal. So I think possible ways somehow to overcome these concerns that are in part legitimate is, for instance, to showing that measures do not need to be onerous or costly necessarily, to provide also further guidance in terms of what we are talking about, how practically to deal with the issues, and also perhaps not to deal with domestic violence as a standalone issue, but woven into a broader set of concerns that may speak to small enterprises, such as, for instance, the link between domestic violence and productivity of small enterprises.
Thanks. You mentioned 2 recent ratifications. Can you say who they were?
2, sorry, ratifications, yes.
Yeah.
Uruguay and Fiji.
Okay, great, thank you. And picking up on a point you made about duty of care, Catherine, if I come to you, with work and home merging largely under the coronavirus lockdowns, where does the duty of care start and where does it end for companies?
That's a terrific question, and one that I don't have a very firm answer for. The law in many countries, including Canada, is of course based on precedent, and we don't have precedent for something like COVID that requires vast numbers of women to suddenly work from home. And so looking at it through my lens in terms of where I think the courts may go if this becomes a litigious issue in Canada, certainly employers do not have a duty to step into the home and look after the woman within the home, but they do, I think, still have a duty to ensure that when the home becomes the workplace, for the period of time that the woman is working in the home for the company, that they are doing their best working with the woman to ensure that there is some sort of protection. And what that protection may be would vary, of course, in every case. I did have a client come to me about 6 weeks ago with this precise question. And we talked over various possible ways of assisting the woman. It turned out that the workplace itself, the physical workspace, not her home workspace, was empty due to COVID, and therefore relatively safe because there was nobody else going in and out of the workplace. And so in that particular case, the company worked with the woman to ensure that she could get back to work outside of the home. She would be the one person in the workspace, and she would have that protection at least while she was at work during the day. And in that particular case, I think that the company probably met whatever duty of care exists and was able to protect the individual.
Very interesting, thank you. Chiara, from your work with women facing domestic violence, what advice would you give them now in these circumstances where they might be either working from home or from the office? What advice would you be giving?
Well, I think the best advice is to do everything to make your employer aware of the situation that you're in. And hopefully the employers are already doing this in the sense that there's been a lot of media awareness that's been raised about the fact that domestic violence has gone up. So maybe employers have already sent communication about this, of who you can talk to, what system is in place, what confidential things the company has put in place for you to report. But if these channels of communications are not in place, then go to HR or go to a manager and open up the conversation about the problems that women face in this situation, because often we find that companies are not acting because they're not aware, and once they are aware, they do care about these things. So if your employer is not bringing it up, bring it up with your employer and make them aware of what you're going through, of the consequences, and try to find the situation that best suits you and an arrangement with your employer. And again, I think employers need to have this flexibility to do everything that they can so that victims do not lose their jobs as a consequence of domestic violence.
Thank you. Marceline, you mentioned, of course, the coronavirus lockdowns have sort of put a spotlight on this issue and they brought it far more to the fore. Are there any campaigns or any efforts now being made in an official or formal way to get governments to act more on this?
Well, there have been, as I said, various statements. For example, the Committee of the Parties of the Istanbul Convention, that is the countries that have ratified, their representatives, issued a statement, and they put their political will behind that statement, saying that all the countries within the Committee of the Parties will be doing their best to ensure that in the current COVID situation, women will remain protected and will have access to the services that they require. So there is clearly some things which are shifting a bit, which are moving a bit. I think it's the Article 17 that I mentioned earlier of the Istanbul Convention speaks specifically about private companies, private sector. So what it says is that the state is required to encourage the private sector to participate in the development of regional, national, local, whatever policies and efforts to prevent violence against women, and also to take part in the implementation of these policies. So the state parties of the convention, the ones that have ratified, are required to encourage the private sector to set up guidelines, to set up protocols that will enhance the respect for the dignity of the woman, and obviously in so doing contributing to the general prevention of violence against women. In the Grevio report for Serbia, for example, the monitoring of Serbia, we noted some private sector initiatives related to this. So they have a project to ensure women's economic independence after a shelter stay. So if a woman has had to leave her home, has had to go to a shelter, that her economic independence can be ensured when she comes out of the shelter. And this project included the Serbian Employers Union. And I think it's important that we encourage employers' unions to form part of these protocols, these arrangements, memorandum of understanding, etc. And indeed, the Union of Employers of a specific region within Serbia also signed a memorandum of understanding with a women's specialist services network working within that region to provide better cooperation and services between them. And Grevio welcomes these sorts of initiatives and calls for even more direct involvement from the private sector. So the more states that ratify the convention, the better position we are in to actually monitor them and suggest recommendations in this regard to them.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Now I'm going to open up to questions. We haven't got long. I know there will be some questions from people as well. My first question, if you could put your camera on so we can see you, say who you are, where you work, who you work for. This is from Ravinsaka Kulasekaran. And this is
Belinda, sorry, you would just pose the question. Sorry, you just posed the question. No one will come on video. Sorry.
Okay. The question is to Catherine. Catherine, are there any periodic assessment evaluations of this workplace violence by the government, apart from the complaint by the individual?
No, the government does not get involved unless an employee goes to the Ministry of Labor in the particular province to complain about perhaps not being provided with the required leave or not being provided with the required assistance. What I will say for Ontario, though, is that it's a statutory obligation as well, that not only does every company, and I'm talking about the very smallest companies to the largest companies, not only does every company need to have a workplace violence policy, but it needs to have an underlying workplace harassment and violence program document. And that program is something that needs to be reviewed on an annual basis by the company so that it can take a look and essentially do a risk assessment of what has changed within the workplace over the past year in terms of the way in which the workplace functions, as well as any potential risks that it's aware of, so that it can then address them. And that program and that policy are actually supposed to be posted in the workplace as well. So it is an ever-evolving document in a best practices world.
Thank you, Catherine. Another question here for the panelists. How can the organisers and other concerned organisations support to build capacity of local NGOs to enable them to drive the processes of ensuring state and non-state actors pursue policies as well as implement such policies to prevent violence against women and girls and children? Chiara, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, sure. So we hope that this webinar will be just the beginning of that. So, we hope that you're going to continue this journey with us. But this was, we're definitely a small local NGO based in France, and we have worked on this report in the prospect of changing things and in gathering a more global movement around this. So please, stay tuned with us, and we will send you more information about how we're going to advance based on this report, and how we can use the report actively to change things together.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I've got a question here from Manuela. Manuela, how can we best get more countries to ratify the ILO Convention?
Well, I mean, through also events like this one. This is indeed a platform that enables to reach out to a rather large audience, which is not necessarily the type of audience that the international organization deals with. So I think that there is need for greater understanding of indeed what is the value added of the convention and the recommendation, support in terms of which are the concrete measures and policies at the organizational level, but also at the national and legal level that are required. It's extremely important to join forces with parliaments, with NGOs, with local level authorities, etc., in order to be able to exert pressure and to also provide solutions. I think that violence and harassment at home, at the workplace, on the street is really a universal and global problem that requires global and common responses. It's not just the responsibility or the duty of the state or the employer to deal with it. It's everybody's responsibility. So partnerships, joining forces, exerting pressure, and lead the way are part of the strategy.
Thank you. I have another question here to put to the panelists. What extent do you think technology is playing a role in gender-based violence in the workplace? Manuela, do you want to start with that one?
Yes, thank you very much for this question, because indeed I think as usual technology is a two-edged sword. On one hand, it indeed allows for working from home or from working anytime, everywhere, in order to suit also our life needs and reconcile paid work with family and life more generally. But at the same time, now technology has become another conduit, another channel through which violence and harassment, which is related to work and not only to work, is taking place. I mean, we have seen during the lockdown not only domestic violence increase, but we have also have been able to see that there has been an increase in cyberbullying and cyber harassment that of course affects both men and women who engage in telework. But when women are concerned, there are very specific manifestations, or the type of aggression, cyber aggression has usually very specific connotations when women are involved.
Thank you. Chiara, have you had reports from many of the women that you have worked with about the use of technology on gender-based violence at work?
So that has not come up yet, because I think it's something that is going to come up right now a lot more because of COVID and people working from home, which was not so much the case before. So I think it's going to be something that's going to be much more on the rise in the future.
Okay, Catherine, is it something that you've come across in Ontario, particularly when you're looking at legislation?
Nothing, no.
No. And Ontario, of course, has emerged as a leader in this space from a legal perspective. As you look ahead and recognise there's always room to do better, of course, do you see any opportunities to improve on the laws or how they can be better implemented?
Sure. Well, you know, everyone can always do better. And I suppose that one way of doing better would be to have spot checks or audits by the government to ensure that companies are all complying with their obligations. That said, it becomes a little bit difficult. Our ministries of labor are responsible for a whole host of issues. So not just this particular issue, but ensuring that employers pay proper wages, ensuring that overtime is paid, ensuring that employees are not taken advantage of and made to work excess hours that they're not being paid for. And so it's always a balancing act, of course, in terms of protection of employees. Our governments do spot checks by industry on an annual basis, not of every company, of course, but they'll drop in on various companies to see what's going on. And they tend, rather than taking a punitive approach, to work with the companies to try to get the companies to better themselves before they begin a punitive approach. Of course, there could always be more of that, but resources are limited always.
Great, thanks. And a final question to Marceline. Marceline, some countries may use times of crisis as an excuse to take some rights back. If a state who has signed and ratified the Istanbul Convention tried to take its signature back, how can Grevio intervene?
Well, first of all, we're very clear, as I said earlier, that the convention applies. I mean, written in the convention, it doesn't say COVID, you understand, because COVID wasn't there, so we couldn't put it in. However, it says in the convention, it says in times of conflict and in times of peace. But we have always been very clear that it also applies in times of pandemic. So in times of sickness or in health, as I said earlier, the convention applies. We issued a statement right at the start of the COVID, making this very clear. So the Grevio, myself as president, issued a statement to all the state parties, making it very clear that they are not excused from their responsibilities as a result of the COVID. And as I said earlier, the Committee of the Parties also issued a declaration and putting their political shoulders behind that declaration, that statement, stating clearly that people are not excused, states are not excused because we are in a pandemic. All of these things still apply. What has happened is that, of course, the issues that we are already aware of were exacerbated. So the weaknesses, where there already was a bit of a lack, a bit of a deficiency, a bit of a weakness, those became much stronger in their weakness, if you see what I mean. And one of the things which I have said, and if you allow me, I will repeat it now here very quickly, is that had the Istanbul Convention been implemented, at least in the countries that ratified, had been properly and adequately implemented, then millions of women and children would have avoided significant hardships, which they did actually go through because the Istanbul Convention, which is considered the gold standard, had not been fully and adequately implemented.
Great, thank you very much. So we've run out of time for this panel, so I'd just like to say thank you very much to all of our panelists, to Chiara, to Catherine, to Marcelina, and to Manuela. Really topical, really interesting discussion. And I now hand back to Julia to take us on to the next discussion.
Thank you, Belinda, and thank you, panel. The last comment really gave us food for thoughts, especially, but all of the panelists were excellent. Thank you so much. And now let's explore the role of companies with the next panel, passing out my virtual mic to our next moderator, Mina Sitterman, Chief Strategy Officer at Economist Group. And thank you very much.
Sorry about that. I was slow to hit the button. Thank you very much, Julia. I think the first panel really gave us a good jumping off point, going from the macro down a little bit to the micro. I think that one of the topics that clearly came up is the role of multinational corporations and companies in general. There's been a growing momentum in, I think, the past decade that these larger companies, because of the influence that their footprints yield, really have a role to play as arbiters of human rights potentially all around the globe. And it's not really an academic question for us anymore. There are different models for how companies can engage, and we'll talk about those later on in the discussion. But I would really like to introduce a great group of panelists who really will kind of cover off, I think, on that trip from policy through to practice. Hermine Botes, who's the head of sustainability engagement at Anglo-American, is joining us today, along with Jane Pillinger, who's a global expert on gender equality and gender-based violence, has done a lot of terrific work around the globe there. And Saleem Bonner, who is the executive director of Kering Foundation. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. And I actually wanted to, Hermine, start with you because I wanted to really have you talk through a little bit the process actually that you and Anglo-American went through, because I think it's a really excellent case and lesson for companies who perhaps don't even realize that this is an issue that they need to be tackling at any level. I know that Anglo-American had been doing a lot in the employee assistance space, but wasn't necessarily targeting this specific problem. So can you talk about what sparked that for you?
Sure. I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. And because I've got imposter syndrome, I wanted to point out that I think we were invited because we aren't doing everything perfectly, but we're giving it a really good go. So there's a clean answer and then there's a slightly more complicated one. And the clean answer is that we developed an inclusion and diversity strategy, and as part of that conducted an employee engagement survey. And in that survey, our executives were distraught to find that more than 50% of people thought that their teams weren't free from bullying, harassment, or victimization. And in very general terms. So we don't know, we didn't at that stage know whether it was one or all of the three. We didn't know whether people were experiencing it themselves or witnessing it. There wasn't a great deal of detail, but that kind of stat is without a doubt alarming. So that's the sort of formal part of it. The informal part of it was everything that was happening in the background. And there was at Anglo-American at the time, increasingly a strong internal women's lobby. And at every senior leadership team meeting, there was one question after the next about gender, about inclusion. And to the credit of our executive, they took it very seriously. The other one was, it's going to sound a bit odd for a mining company, but storytelling and testimonies. We had a session about the future of work, so nothing really to do, well, at that stage with this. But in that session, which we called an open forum, we had a very senior group of people, and we had a storytelling session. And a young woman, a young mining engineer, and that's very rare, okay? So we only have about 21% of the workforce are female, and young technical women are quite rare for us. They're gold for us. You would think that we would treat women like that the best. She sat and told a story about how she was treated as a senior woman on a mine, from utter disrespect. And in that session, I saw grown men cry, grown miners cry. And something changed there, because what became theoretical and something that you think might happen turned into, I can see someone in front of me right now, a smart, dignified woman who has been so deeply hurt by the way that she has experienced her time underground as a miner. Me Too happened, and our executives started talking about their children coming to them, their girls and their boys coming to them and saying, so what are you doing? And they did step up. Employee networks started popping up, an LGBT plus network in South Africa, in London, Vocal, and with our CEOs there to help launch those networks, women's networks, people with differently abled people network. So it was a formal story that was backed up by little nudges here and there that ultimately got us to a place where we were able to have a real conversation about it.
And so I would actually argue that it's fine that you're not doing it perfectly, because nobody does it perfectly. If you know, the starting is kind of the hurdle that we all have to get over, I think. And I think that the notion of storytelling is actually incredibly powerful. The line I sometimes use is that the shortest distance between two people is a story, because it takes the abstract and makes it really concrete. So being able to do that, I think, is helpful. My understanding too is that Anglo-American then undertook a kind of mapping exercise to help really understand the problem across the organization. Can you talk a little bit about that mapping exercise and what some of the outcomes of that have been since you started it?
Yep. So after all of that mushy storytelling, we became minors again. And we wanted facts and figures. We needed to move beyond a perception. We wanted something black and white in front of us that wasn't purely anecdotal. Because if you go back into a number of other studies, you see comments here and there. When you go into a study about absenteeism, you don't see it in the numbers, but you see it in the side notes. What we wanted was something independent and clear. So we have for many years worked with International Alert on various aspects of human rights and conflict. And they've got a top class unit that deals with gender-based violence and conflict. They conducted a study at 2 of our operations on the experience of women and vulnerable groups there. So it wasn't quantitative, but the one operation managed to reach something like 800 people. At a slightly smaller one, in some form or another, managed to hear 17% of the workforce. So after those 2 studies, we had specific research that's independent that we could put in front of people that are used to reacting to facts and to numbers and to understanding the root cause, because in as much as we, myself in particular, really wanted to start fixing things, we didn't want to jump into fixing things that actually weren't fundamentally the problem. So that's the initial stage that we went through.
Great. I think that's really helpful. And I'm going to bring Jane into the conversation because of something you said, which was that, you know, you see the absenteeism, but you don't know the elements around it. And Jane, you've done a lot of really interesting work with UN Women and ILO. And what really comes through, especially in some of the more recent briefs you've been writing, is this notion that it isn't just, it isn't a bifurcated issue. It isn't something that happens at home that is separate from work. It is actually kind of a Venn diagram of issues, right? That where there's a number of factors that bleed into one another across a person's life. And I think that the ethical reasons for jumping in to help solve this are clear, but can you talk a little bit about some of those issues where we see those factors surface in the workplace that can really make the argument for a company stepping in to play a role in this?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm really delighted to be part of this webinar, and we're having some great discussions. It's really fantastic to see the lens being put onto this issue. I suppose just to start with, in terms of how to persuade companies to take the issue on board, I mean, one of the things that I suppose the starting point is that you can get an evidence base. So I've been involved in 2 company surveys. One was with Vodafone, a global survey. There was another survey with the 1 in 3 Women network of companies in France, of which Kering was one of the original founders of the 1 in 3 network. And maybe Saleem will say a bit more about that later. But actually what the surveys did, and you know, the fact that they were company surveys rather than population-based surveys, that of the people that reported that they'd experienced domestic violence, 50% of them said that it had affected their work in one of at least 3 ways. Presenteeism, you know, when they're working but not being productive. Absence from work, it might be sick leave, it might be turning up to work late. And productivity, broad issues around productivity. And ultimately, many women leave their jobs because that's part of the coercive control, is to stop women working. And we've seen the impact of coercive control in terms of preventing women getting to work, preventing them from going into career development opportunities, preventing them from progressing in their careers and so on. So I think, you know, we can show that on the one hand, you know, a large proportion of your employees at any one particular time are likely to be affected by domestic violence. And furthermore, you may have perpetrators of domestic violence also in your workforce, and they may be perpetrating domestic violence during working time. And actually, it was interesting with the work that we're involved in with Vodafone, because Vodafone said, you know, mobile phone company, and they said anybody that is using workplace resources to perpetrate domestic violence, whether it's somebody that's employed by Vodafone or outside of a partner, that would be automatic dismissal. And Vodafone took a very hard line on that because of, you know, workplace resources of mobile phones, tablets, computers are essential to their business. So on the one hand, you've got the evidence base. The second part of that is really trying to map what that means in terms of costs. And I think Gabriela Ramos, mentioned some of the costs that have been, I won't go over that, but, you know, it costs companies millions. It costs them millions. I mean, we can't underestimate the impact of domestic violence. If women leave the workplace, they, you know, you've got retention costs, you've got recruitment costs, replacement costs. If they're at work and they're not productive and not progressing into their careers. And we know that one of the issues that's absolutely critical about gender equality strategies in the workplace is that if women can progress in their careers, we're more likely to see gender equality outcomes. So we know victims of domestic violence are more likely to work in part-time work, low-paid work, and not progress in their careers. That's not good either for the bottom line of companies. And I think the other issue that we've seen, and I'm really glad to hear the discussion in Canada and also on the last panel about duty of care, because actually during the COVID-19 pandemic, this issue about what is the duty of care has really come up in a lot of discussions. I've been working quite a few multinational companies and with trade unions in trying to identify what managers can do when women are working remotely from home. You know, what are the possibilities of giving support, of spotting the signs of domestic violence, because you have to remember that, you know, when women come into work, they're able to access support, information. They can do that during working hours and at a time when they're not going to be victimized. So that has been a really interesting debate that has opened up internationally. And I was really interested to see in New Zealand, no, sorry, it was in Australia, just 2 weeks ago, the New South Wales High Court ruled that the employer does have a duty of care when somebody is working from home. It was actually a case of femicide. And the court ruled, and this was about, you know, the costs that were being sought from the employer by her children, that in fact the employer did have a duty of care and was liable to provide compensation. So I think there's a really, really interesting issue about, you know, what does this mean in terms of your occupational safety and health? How do you integrate that into your occupational safety and health obligations? And one of the great things, I mean, I'm so delighted Manuela Tomei was on the panel because, you know, the convention, ILO Convention 190 and the Recommendation 206 actually make it a responsibility of governments to put a duty on employers to mitigate the risks of domestic violence. And this is crucial as a health and safety issue. So how do we get that into health and safety committees and so on is really important as well as part of that whole duty of care. So it's rather a long way round of saying, you know, there are economic issues, you know, there are well-being at work issues, but also there are fundamental human rights issues. That domestic violence isn't something that just occurs in the private area of the home. Sometimes the home is the workplace. Sometimes domestic violence follows women into the workplace. I mean, we've seen many femicides across the world happening in the workplace itself. And they happen in the workplace because sometimes that's the only place where an abuser can find a woman, particularly at a risky time after leaving a violent relationship. So we know, for example, that car parks are some of the most dangerous places for women. Car parks in relation to the office or nearby to the office. So all of these issues, you know, duty of care, economic costs, well-being are absolutely crucial. And I'm really pleased to see the ILO Convention being passed and a queue of countries now who are going to be ratifying the convention. And more companies realizing that this actually is a really crucial issue, being integrated into collective agreements, jointly agreed initiatives in the workplace, and so on. So
Jane,
yeah, I could say more, but
I know I actually feel like I want to do an entire panel just with you, because I've been reading some of your recent briefs and they're fascinating and really actionable. And I want to put a pin in this for a moment, because I actually do want to come back to the actions and talk to all three of you together. But I want to make sure to bring Saleem into the conversation, because you made the point, and I think Gabriela made this point too, that this isn't a solution, a problem that gets solved simply by the private sector or by governments or by NGOs. It requires partnerships and people kind of investing all together to solve the problem. And Saleem from the Kering Foundation, I think they've done they take a very interesting approach. I talked a little bit about how different MNCs engage in different models. This Kenji Yoshino from the Center of Diversity talks about the when in Rome model, where it's like, we don't touch anything. The embassy model, where within our four walls, we are very progressive, but you're on your own outside. And then there's more of an advocate model where you engage with the community. And I think Kering's taken a pretty specific stance on this. So Saleem, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the approach that Kering takes, and the programs that you have in place, the way you work through this issue. From your vantage point as a company with a pretty large footprint around the world.
Yeah, thank you, Mina. I'm really delighted to launch this report today with Thomson Reuters and led by her and Dentons, and to be part of this panel with Jane and Hermine. So the Kering Foundation started to work on combating violence against women in 2008. So it was long before the Me Too movement. And our approach to work on violence against women globally was to work with a limited number of local partners. So we're working with local nonprofits. And we have a close relationship and support local survivor-centered organizations that provide services to women survivors. For the last 2 years, we also started working on prevention, working with the youth and particularly young men and boys. And eventually, we also want to act together. So that's a point that Jane mentioned, and I'll come back to it, bringing other companies to get engaged into this combat. So when we started back in 2008, one of our objectives was to break the silence about violence against women. Now we're living an exciting moment because the topic is everywhere, in a lot of places at least, but at that time it was a very big taboo. And it was natural for us to first engage our employees in this combat. 1 in 4 women is a survivor of domestic abuse in the EU. So we have survivors inside our company, and it is key for these women to keep their job. So we believe it's our responsibility to make the company a supportive place for women survivors. So since 2011, we've rolled out training workshops on domestic violence to over 1,500 employees, including the group and the brand's executive committees in 4 countries. So France, UK, Italy, and the US for the moment. And we had a very pragmatic approach after discussing with our partner NGOs. So we started a discussion with Solidarité Femmes in France, and then we went to Italy, and we designed together training sessions to raise awareness of our employees on what is domestic violence, what is its impact for the survivor, what is its impact for the workplace, and how can any of us, colleagues, managers, HR, staff reps, we can support this woman if and when she wants to disclose. So it's really about having the right mindset, understanding the issue, knowing where is the information, and being able to know the best non-profit and specialist organization working on the topic that can support the survivor. So all these sessions are on a volunteer base, and as I said, we try to reach any employee in the organization.
That's excellent. I think that guidance is really good about really getting the right mindset, educating on the issue, and then making sure that people have access to the information. And by engaging with these external groups, local to the region, you start to affect change in the broader community, not just change within your four walls, which is fantastic. So this actually sort of brings me to my next question, which is really for all of you at some level. And I think we've talked a little bit in both panels around this notion that it can be challenging to figure out, if you are a company, where to begin when you are tackling this issue with any large issue like this around human rights that may have cost implications, that may be controversial to some. How would you suggest that people action this? And I think that it's particularly daunting for small and mid-sized businesses who may not have the resource behind them that larger companies with more funding may have. Are there specific actions that we can take across the board, do you think, that that could be useful for any company just as they try to move into this space, independent of size? I'll actually start with Jane, and then here, let's do this. Jane, Hermine, and then Saleem, so that we can kind of get the perspective of all three of you, because I'm sure you've thought about this actually quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I'd say to any company, there's small steps that you can take and then build on those. And I mean, I'll just give you an example. Just recently, it was just before the lockdown, there was a local company in the town nearby to where I live, where a woman had been affected by domestic violence. And actually, it was quite a tragic case. It was really awful, and the company wanted to do something. So they decided to start doing some fundraising. They invited me to come and give a little talk to them about, what they could do. They were a very small company. They were the employees who wanted to do some fundraising and donate some money to a local domestic violence charity. So it was really interesting, because it was the first time I'd been in touch with a small company on this work, because most of my work is with large companies who do have resources. And I think to say, obviously, the more resource you've got, the more you can put into training, developing policies, implementing them, producing nice glossy documents and all the rest of it. But I would say everybody can play a role in preventing domestic violence. And the first step for a company would be to have an up-to-date list of who you can contact for legal advice, a domestic violence organisation that can give you advice about a protection order, very, very practical things that you can find by just looking on the internet, or partnering with a local domestic violence agency to come and talk to your employees and your managers about raising awareness. And I think starting at that point is really important. And then integrating, instead of putting a big resource into developing a policy and launching it and doing all the work that's needed around that, try and begin by integrating domestic violence into your existing policies and procedures. Every company today, most companies indeed, will have a policy on flexible working hours, or a policy on parental or other forms of leave, and they'll have a health and safety committee with obligations to carry out risk assessments. Bringing domestic violence into those is another way of just working with what you have. And I'd say another step that would be really practical, and sometimes we have to think about this in very practical ways, have a contact person in the company that somebody trusts. Now, big companies have been able to have, advocacy programs where there's a network of people that have been trained to give information and so on on a confidential basis. But have a named person in your HR team, or on the management team, or in the trade union that you can go to, that there's a phone number you can telephone to find some confidential advice and support. And sometimes that first step is really important. And just having a conversation about domestic violence in the workplace can make all the difference, because one of the big problems is that women don't speak out. There's a silence around domestic violence. They're worried about losing their jobs. They're worried about recrimination or retaliation if they do speak about an issue. Where still, unfortunately, there's a culture of impunity in many countries, where there's a silence and there's a victim blaming. And that culture exists in every country that I know, even in the countries with the best policies and procedures. So we need to make it safe and trustworthy for women to speak about domestic violence. And one way we can do that is to give managers the support about how to communicate, how to be empathetic, how to be non-judgmental, and so on.
So before I bring in the other two speakers, I'm actually going to share a question from the attendees, because I do think that it sort of ties into this. The question's from Dr. Jaya Gajparia, I hope I pronounced that correctly, from London South Bank University. I'm currently looking at putting a proposal together for mandatory training for staff to empower themselves on how to help students or staff if domestic abuse is thought to be happening. Do you think this would be a good way forward for companies as well? So Hermine and Celine, I will turn to the two of you. I think this ties into some of the work that you have done at your companies. And then we will quickly wrap after that. Go ahead, Hermine. Sorry. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Hermine.
Let me touch very quickly on the question around where to start. And I do think that it is in some soft places. So opening up the space for a conversation about something that's pretty awkward for a lot of people. I remember 11 years ago, being in a board meeting, not because I'm important, I was coordinating reporting at that time, but there was a conversation about HIV/AIDS. And when our head of health spoke about condoms and intercourse, the board members cringed. It was just not something that you spoke about at work. It was really uncomfortable. So we need to open up spaces for conversations that are uncomfortable. Make both moral and logical appeals. Some people do things because it's the right thing to do. Some people make a decision because it's the logical thing to do. And I think both of those types of thinking need to be appealed to. And to make sure that we have men in business as partners in this process. On the training thing, I absolutely agree that that's a critical step. I should clarify that a lot of our work up until now has actually been on workplace harassment. And it is still a big issue for us, and there's a lot of work to do. Domestic violence has always been part of the package, but something that we put slightly further out into the future, acknowledging that there's no real boundary between these things, especially in mining where you have pretty remote mines, and the communities around the mines are very mixed up in either the supply chains or the workforce of the mines. So that was always on the agenda. What brought it way forward was COVID, and what we've seen, not just in South Africa, everywhere in the world, really. Back to the question about training. So part of the fear in us entering the space of addressing domestic violence through workplace interventions was, do our people have the skills to help? Do managers know how to treat an employee? Not just from a policy point of view, but from a personal point of view, who is a victim of abuse. And in that, training is absolutely critical. We've got bullying, harassment, and victimization training that's mandatory across the entire group. And we are training up 15% of our workforce to be mental health first aiders, which is a step in that direction.
So that's excellent. And I imagine, Celine, that you probably are quite positive on training as well, given the background that you've given us on Kering Foundation.
Yeah, I'm completely positive on trainings, and it's very important to have face-to-face training, but at the same time, if you want it to be brought to scale, you also need to have online tools. So I think that on the key points to put this kind of initiative in place, I think it's very important to have the top managers involved. And on our end, we were lucky to have our chairman and CEO, Mr. Pinault, who was committed on this topic from the beginning. So this also helps to disseminate this kind of commitment. To add on what Hermine said, I think that it's domestic violence, and the root cause of violence is about gender equality. So you also need to have a clear gender equality strategy inside the company, and to be clear that men and women have to be involved. And coming back to the trainings, it's not always clear for men that they are also invited to the training, of course. And eventually, I think that one of the good thing to do is to join a network of other companies. That's some of the things that Jane mentioned, and that's what we did with the 1 in 3 Women network that we co-funded with FAST Foundation. So it's the first European network of companies working against gender-based violence. L'Oréal, Carrefour, BNP Paribas, and some more joined us. And the good thing about it is that you put in common your best practices, you develop some tools. And so, for instance, talking of online training, we will have an e-learning training coming after this summer. It's an open network, and it would really be great to have more people on board. So feel free to join us.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Julia's been giving me the hook for about 7 minutes. I apologize. So I do have to end this. We could talk forever. Thank you so much to our great panelists. And Julia, back to you. So sorry. I was riveted. I apologize.
No, please don't apologize. This was so interesting, and it's difficult for me to. The insights were wonderful, really. Some great efforts, I feel, and inspiring. I hope to other companies listening in. So thank you to the panel and to Mina for such a great moderated discussion. I pass it with no further ado to Monica Kisser for closing remarks. She's the head of social policy at the OECD. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thanks to everybody for this fantastic report and this great event. I mean, I agree with Mina. I was riveted, and and while I was listening to all of this, my head was spinning already, thinking about how we at the OECD can engage with this fantastic initiative even more. We're already engaged. It was mentioned by Gabriela at the beginning that in February the OECD had a very comprehensive conference at which many of you were present, actually, on violence against women in the broadest sense, looking at the options for the OECD to engage on this very important topic. Now, what you perhaps know is that the primary interlocutors of the OECD are governments, but we also engage with all other stakeholders. And while I was listening here, I'm thinking that in integrated service delivery, which is one of the areas we're looking at, because we know that women who are victims and survivors of violence against them do need this whole set of services in one place, coordinated in order to not make a very difficult situation even worse by having to tell your story 25 times and not getting all the help you need. And while I was listening to Catherine tell us about the case of the woman who went to work all alone in Canada, being the only person in the house, what happened? Why did she have to go home? How do we coordinate these activities in the governments with the government services, the companies with the government services? So how can we work on the interface between all the wonderful things you're doing in companies and the social service delivery that needs to be there to help these women? I'm struck also often, if you listen to witnesses, if you listen to accounts of stories of when things went wrong and women ended up being killed, very often people in companies were aware of the situation before, but couldn't really do anything. So just as an integrated service delivery where we're not sure how can medical services, police, judicial services, social services, psychologists all share the information, this becomes even more complicated. So how can you in companies share this very private information that you see or the suspicions that you have with the social services who would be the next in line to help by providing housing or other services that are needed. So I hope that going forward, we can work together to address precisely this nexus and leverage your work into a larger community of people providing social services and promote bringing those two sides together. So from your side, that would mean from all the companies and Jane and everybody else involved in this topic to think about what is it that you would need for companies based on your experience in companies. What would you need from governments? And then we have the infrastructure to bring those governments around the table and facilitate that conversation. I think that could be a very good next step. And I hope, of course, that our partners in crime in the last conference, like Thomson Reuters, like Kering, like 1 in 3 Women, and hopefully led by her as well, and others who we haven't been engaged with, might be interested in joining forces and thinking about how we can move ahead on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica. That was inspiring, and hopefully a call for action to partner with you and to partner with each other to really address this issue together. And the Thomson Reuters was really delighted to partner on this event led by her and Kering Foundation. Everyone on panels and speaker were all excellent and provided really great insight. So thank you. And thank you for Dentons, who led the pro bono legal research and helped Thomson Reuters Australia to lead the research, which is an excellent research that I hope everyone can read. And I think on the last slide that is coming up soon, you'll have the link that is coming out. I also wanted to flag, if everyone ever needs pro bono legal research, please come to us at TrustLaw so we can happily help you and link you with amazing law firm like Dentons that provides pro bono. And then mostly thank you for everyone that organized this event behind the scene, and thank to you, to everyone that were listening in. And we really hope this doesn't stop here, that we've just started a conversation and that we'll continue to address this topic together. Again, if Maxine, can you put the link on? You can go and see on the slide and on trust.org, the research that was launched today, and also you will find it, here it is, thank you. So here it is the research, and it will be a replay and recording led by her website, and we will send it on email to everyone. Again, we had over 180 participants, and I hope this means there's a lot of action coming from this. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Ciao.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.